I opened my eyes, but I couldn't see anything. It was completely dark. There was no light at all. Everything was black. I closed my eyes and opened them again, but still I could see nothing. Where was I? I realized I was lying on my back, on something hard and cold. I reached out my hand and felt a stone floor, cold and damp beneath my fingers. I was lying in a stone room. Could it be a tomb? Was I in a place where the dead were buried? I knew I had to move and find out. I turned over onto my hands and knees, then started to crawl forward. In a few seconds, I reached a wall. It was cold and wet. Maybe I was in a room that was underground. I followed the wall very slowly, thinking I was moving in a circle, though I wasn't sure. Suddenly, an idea struck me. I tore a piece of cloth from my shirt and placed it on the floor near the wall. Then I continued along the wall, counting the number of times I moved my hands forward. 20, 30, 40 times. But where was the cloth? Had I passed it in the dark? Had I gone around the room twice? I counted up to 100 before I found the piece of cloth again. However, I hadn't found a dead body in a coffin. I wasn't in a tomb. Where was I? I tried to remember. I recalled being in Toledo, Spain. Then I remembered a courtroom and men in red robes. They had asked me questions, more and more questions. Their voices were soft, their eyes bright. How many hours had they questioned me? I couldn't recall. The questions had gone on and on. But what was my crime? What law had I broken? I didn't know. Fear gripped me. I thought the questioners were going to torture me. But no one had cut me with sharp blades. No one had struck me, and no one had burned me with hot iron. Now I must be in a jail, a prison cell. Maybe I would die here without food, water, or light. I closed my eyes again, and I must have slept. When I awoke, I moved my foot, and it hit something. I reached out and touched a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. A jailer had come into my prison cell and left food and drink. I knew that my prison cell was large, but what was in the center? For a few minutes, I sat with my back against the wall. Then I started to crawl straight ahead across the floor of the cell. I moved very slowly. Suddenly, my hand went down and forward. I had found a hole, a pit in the floor. I could feel and smell damp air rising from the pit. I guessed that the pit was very deep. I had almost fallen into it. My body shook with fear, and my skin was covered with sweat. The drops of sweat fell from my face and down into the deep hole. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A small door opened above my head, and light shone down on me for a few seconds. I saw my prison cell. Then the small door shut again, and everything was dark and black. I was right. I was in a room with a deep pit in its center. I understood now. My torturers had been waiting and watching. They wanted me to jump into the deep pit. They wanted me to end my life. I slowly crawled back to the pitcher of water and the bread. My arms and legs were shaking. I was weak and too tired. I took a piece of bread and started to eat. The bread tasted of salt. I quickly drank the water from the pitcher. Soon after this, I felt very, very tired, and I slept again. When I awoke, the cell was not completely dark. I could just see its walls. The room was square, and each wall was about 15 feet long. The walls were not made of stone. They were made of metal. High in the center of the ceiling, there was a small door. Strange and terrible pictures were carved into the metal walls. The pictures were of evil spirits and monsters. I was lying on my back, but I could not get up. I was no longer lying on the stone floor. My body was tied to a wooden bed, and a rope was tied around my chest, but I could move my arms. I reached out my hands and tried to find the pitcher of water. I was very thirsty. There was no water, but I found a dish of meat. I put a piece of the meat into my mouth. No, I could not eat the meat. I looked up at the ceiling, and it was full of salt and strong spices. It was a picture of time. My jailers wanted me to be thirsty. An old man with a long beard. This was a new torture. Pictures of time always showed an old bearded man with an hourglass in his hand. Hourglasses had 2 containers inside them, made of glass, joined in the center. One of the containers was filled with sand. When all the sand had run from one container to the other, an hour had passed. Time also held a long, sharp scythe. Every living thing is killed by time. But in the picture on the ceiling, the blade of Time's scythe was not part of the painting. It was real, and it was sharp. It was made of metal and hung down from the ceiling. The blade was like the pendulum of an old clock. As I watched, the pendulum started to move. It moved slowly, backward and forward. Suddenly, I heard a noise beside me. It was the sound of many small animals running on hard ground. Then I heard high, sharp cries. Rats. There were rats here in the cell. They had climbed out of the pit. Several large, black rats ran across the floor toward my wooden bed. I moved my arms and shouted, trying to frighten them away. The rats looked at me with their red eyes. They opened their mouths, and I saw their sharp, pointed teeth. Were the rats going to be my next torture? I looked up at the pendulum again. It was moving more quickly now. As it moved backward and forward, it made a soft whooshing sound. Whoosh! The pendulum swung back behind my head, and I could not see it. Then it swung forward over my feet. Whoosh! As I watched, I saw that the pendulum was lowering. Very slowly, the pendulum was getting closer to me. Now I saw the reason for the pendulum. This was how I was going to die. The sharp blade of the pendulum was going to kill me. But it was not going to kill me quickly. It was going to cut my body very, very slowly. The pain would be terrible. How many times was the blade going to cut my body? How long was I going to lie on the wooden bed? How many times was I going to scream as my blood ran onto the floor? One of the rats ran over my hand. I cried out and pulled my hand away quickly. The dish of meat was still beside me. The rats could smell the meat, and they wanted it. Suddenly, I had an idea. I reached out my hand and took some of the meat from the dish. Then I rubbed the spiced meat onto the rope that was around my body. I rubbed the meat all along the rope. Then I lifted my hands above my head and lay still. At first, the rats were scared of me. They didn't come too close. Then one of them jumped onto my chest. I stayed still, even though I wanted to move. I felt the rat's tiny sharp feet on my body. I saw its red eyes and sharp teeth. I tried not to scream. The rat moved closer to the rope, smelling the spiced meat. It started biting the rope with its sharp teeth. Soon, another rat jumped onto me. It also started to eat the rope. More and more rats came, running over my face and body. I kept my mouth and eyes closed, trying not to shout in fear. I tried to stop my body from shaking. The rats' feet and tails touched me. I felt them on my mouth, eyes, and nose. I heard their high, sharp cries. The sound of the pendulum became louder. The whooshing noise of the pendulum was louder than the rats. The blade was getting closer to my body. I felt the air move as it passed over my face. The pendulum swung widely. I counted each time it passed over me. 6 seconds. 7 seconds. Then the blade swung back. 6. 7. Whoosh. The pendulum swung lower and lower. It was now just inches above me, moving slower. The huge blade scared the rats, and they ran away. They knew they were in danger. They had eaten part of the rope, but I wasn't free yet. I waited for the pendulum to cut the rope completely. 7 seconds. 8 seconds. The pendulum whooshed above my body from head to foot, then foot to head. 7. 8. Whoosh! It was very close now. I tried to make my body lower on the bed. Where was the blade going to cut me? My head? My chest? My stomach? I screamed. The blade cut, and it sliced through the rope. The pendulum swung toward my feet. Suddenly, I was free. I jumped from the wooden bed and lay on the floor. Sweat was pouring from my skin, and I was breathing fast. The pendulum whooshed past one more time. Then it stopped. The small door in the ceiling was open. My torturers were watching. They had seen me escape from the blade. Suddenly, the pendulum moved back into the ceiling and stopped. But I wasn't safe yet. A little later, I smelled something new. It wasn't the smell of rats or the dark pit. It was the smell of hot iron. The metal walls of the cell were getting hot. I moved closer to the pit. It was cooler there. This was part of their plan. They were heating the walls. When the cell became too hot, I would have to jump into the pit. The pit was cool and damp, but the cell walls weren't just hot. They were moving too. The hot metal walls were moving toward me. The pictures of the evil spirits and monsters were now red. They were getting hotter. I was going to burn on the walls or fall into the pit. I didn't have much time. I stood on the edge of the pit and closed my eyes. The walls, floor, and air were hot. I felt the terrible heat on my face and hands. I was ready to fall. This was the end. I was going to die in this horrible place. Suddenly, I heard voices. People were shouting. I heard guns. People were fighting. Then I heard another sound. The walls were moving again. What was happening now? I was weak and tired, my arms and legs shaking. The walls were moving back, but it was too late. My clothes were starting to burn. I was about to fall. I was already falling. Then someone grabbed my arm and pulled me back. I turned my head and saw the person who saved me. It was a soldier, wearing the uniform of the French army. French soldiers had captured the city of Toledo. All the prisoners were free. Many years ago, I first met Mr. William Legrand, who lived on Sullivan's Island near Charleston. The island is situated in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South Carolina. Sullivan's Island is quite small, stretching 3 miles in length and just over half a mile in width. A narrow creek separates the island from the mainland. On the island stood a single large building, Fort Moultrie, where soldiers were stationed to guard the South Carolina coast. Legrand had once been wealthy, but he lost all his money. His fine house and property in New Orleans were sold, and he left Louisiana, eventually settling on Sullivan's Island. He had no family, his parents were deceased, and he had no siblings, spouse, or children. He lived with a servant named Jupiter Legrand in a small wooden house by the sea. They caught fish and birds for food and rarely visited Charleston, despite its proximity. I lived in Charleston and sometimes visited Legrand by crossing the creek in a small boat. Legrand was an intriguing man with a good education, but also a peculiar disposition. He enjoyed the solitude of his island home and often went for days without speaking. However, when he was excited, he could talk for hours. During my visits, we discussed many topics, including the books he had read and the wildlife around his home. He even drew pictures of the creatures he observed. One October day, I visited Legrand's home, but no one was there. As it was cold, I went into his small wooden house, started a fire, and waited. Later in the afternoon, Legrand and Jupiter returned. They had been exploring the shore and discovered an unusual insect. Legrand was very excited about this insect, describing it as having strange patterns on its back. When I asked to see the insect, Legrand said it was with Lieutenant Gray, who had shown interest in it. He had taken it to the fort, hoping to identify it. Legrand then began to draw a picture of the insect for me. It was a beetle with a round body and 6 legs adorned with 3 unusual marks. I commented that it resembled a scarab, a type of beetle once believed to have magical properties in ancient Egypt. Jupiter then interjected that the insect was not alive but made of gold. Legrand dismissed this and said that, despite the golden color, the marks on its back were in the shape of a skull, 2 small spots above a larger one, resembling eyes and a mouth. This pattern, known as a death's head, suggested something significant.